The American West is one of the most beautiful and diverse environments in the world, and its history is a fascinating story about gunslingers, Native Americans, the U.S. Army, and settlers. A tale about the struggle to survive, greed, and progress has emerged. You're watching Western Brahmin, and this is episode 4. The day is September 5th, 1877. A famous Native American warrior is taken captive by U.S. soldiers. After realizing that they are going to attempt to lock him in captivity, Crazy Horse lashes out, attempting to resist the arrest, and is stabbed by one of the sentry soldiers. The symbol of an indigenous tribal leader not giving up and fighting tooth and nail to his very last breath is a feeling that resonates with all of us. The great heroes of the past were endowed with a passion that echoes through every man. It is built into our very nature as humans to protect and stand for our tribe, our family, and our people. This event, along with the death of Sitting Bull 13 years later, is seen by many in the Native American community as the final blow of their culture and way of life. Crazy Horse is honored by groups all around the world for his warrior spirit and courage to stand up for his people and culture against the progress of the United States that viewed the land and the people on it as nothing more than an opportunity for profit. The generally accepted theory is that sometime between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, Native Americans migrated to the continental U.S. via a land bridge called Beringia that opened up between Siberia and Alaska. Although an alternative theory called the Solutrean Hypothesis has been proposed that some Native American admixture comes from European West hunter-gatherers that used boats to cross the North Atlantic. This theory revolves around the fact that Solutrean spear points and early Native American or Clovis points are extremely similar and difficult to reproduce. Though the Solutrean hypothesis is intriguing, the route through the Bering Strait is likely the origin of the original natives. The Clovis people lived in the Americas until approximately 9,800 BC, when they were almost entirely wiped out. Recent studies have concluded that a comet hit the ice sheet that existed over much of modern-day Canada, wiping out a majority of the megafauna and early populations in North America. This major event may have caused the rapid change in global temperatures called the Younger Dryas. Skeletal remains associated with Clovis people appear to be more European in shape, but this does not confirm or deny the Solutrean hypothesis, as we only have one confirmed sample to date. Either way, North American natives share ancestry with the same population that makes up modern-day Europeans. If we assume the traditional hypothesis of the peopling of North America, we know that modern Native Americans are still more closely related to an ancient population that shares ancestry with modern-day Europeans. Ancient North Eurasians were a group of mammoth hunters that lived in Siberia roughly 20,000 years ago. These robust people mixed with a population that we call ancient Northeast Asians before migrating into North America. The same group of mammoth hunters also moved west, intermixing with Eastern and Caucasus hunter-gatherers to create the group known as the Indo-Europeans. Haplogroups R1a and R1b are believed to originate in this population, and we do find a large amount of haplogroup R1b even in modern-day Native Americans. R1b is also the most common haplogroup in Western Europe, which fits the Solutrean hypothesis as well. One thing that is for certain is the mistreatment that the Native Americans received at the hands of the U.S. government. Over the last century, Hollywood has pushed the cowboy versus Indian narrative, in my opinion, to shift the narrative away from the fact that corporations and the government were the main perpetrators in the story. There were certainly small feuds and skirmishes between early settlers and natives, but the majority of the oppression was dealt at the hands of the United States military, attempting to move these people off their land for corporations to take advantage of resources and minerals. Modern media and liberal groups today place more emphasis on blaming white men for the problems of natives and other minority groups than they do on the corporations and businesses that actually pushed for their oppression for centuries. The Transcontinental Railroad was a big money capitalist focus of the time, and businessmen all across the Union were trying to get their hands on some of the profits. Native American tribes who wanted to remain on their lands were in the way of these tycoons, and much of the atrocities committed against the natives were in the name of progress for these men. The idea of a transcontinental railroad was dreamed up and developed by an engineer named Theodore Judah. Judah succeeded in signing up 4 Sacramento merchants, later known as the Big Four: Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. On July 1, 1862, President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act into law, which authorized the issuance of land grants and U.S. bonds to CPRR and the newly chartered Union Pacific Railroad for the construction of a transcontinental railroad. This would allow railroad companies to receive grants from the United States government to connect the East and the West to further develop trade and commerce. Many businesses and investors involved in the building of these railroads were wrapped up in controversy and scandal. One such scandal was the Credit Mobile scandal, which was a 2-part scheme where the company building the railroad inflated the estimated building cost when applying for the grant. They would then build the railroad for a lower cost and pocket the excess grant money. This is an excerpt taken from americanhistory.si.edu. The U.S. Congress granted millions of acres of land to railroad companies. According to treaties ratified by Congress, these lands belong to different indigenous nations. In other words, Congress granted land to railroad companies that was not legal under its control. The different forms of indigenous resistance to railroad construction were neither savage nor illegal. These were forms of resistance to uphold treaties, the supreme law of the land. The possibility of indigenous resistance posed risks to investors. In response, the United States government enlisted the U.S. Army to ensure that resistance could be contained. The Army and state militia enforced the progress of construction through military occupation of indigenous communities, deliberately targeting villages and food sources. This took the form of massacres of entire villages at Sand Creek and Blue Water Creek, assassination of tribal diplomatic leaders, attempts to isolate children from their families, and the wholesale destruction of the buffalo herds. The goal was to destroy the ability of indigenous nations to contest the invasion and occupation of their lands. The railroads themselves facilitated these military tactics to enable swift troop and supply movements over great distances in harsh weather. Despite the efforts of both railroad officials and military authorities, indigenous people resisted. In the summer of 1867, for example, Cheyenne raids led to the complete disruption of railroad construction. Massive villages conducted strategic attacks on military outposts, settler communities, and the Overland Trail, completely isolating Denver from the United States for a time. Resistance continued well after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1873, Lakotas took up armed resistance against the Northern Pacific Railroad's illegal incursion on their homelands. Despite genocidal violence and ecological destruction, the indigenous nations invaded by colonialism are still here today. What does all of this mean for us? Indigenous cultures are being erased around the world in the name of progress. Whether it be Native Americans, Tibetans, or Native Europeans, the quest for money and progress does not care about a group's way of life. In America, we are told day in and day out by the media that white men are the problem and the cause for this. But if you look a little deeper into the situation, this is not necessarily the case. Progress and profit have pushed people out of their homelands and forced third world people into sweatshops. Hopefully, Americans who have spent the last few weeks in quarantine are starting to understand that they don't need all of the luxuries that they thought they did. The beauty of a world with different cultures living in their homeland is much more respectable than a world without culture driven by profit and capital gain. With a pandemic currently ravaging the planet, we have to take a close look at globalization and decide if it has actually done us any good. In my opinion, it has not. Thank you for watching.